Thank you, Florence. Thank you. Thank you for continuously hosting a legal track. I love it. I'm Simon. Hi, everybody. I love bad jokes, right? So I don't know if any of you remember the whole something for fun and profit. So I named my talk "Content Licenses in TTRPG for Fun and Prof." Never mind, right? Because there's this saying that how to make a small fortune in tabletop role-playing games is you start with a big fortune, right? And so this talk is for me, right? I'm Simon. I volunteer for FSFE. We have a booth on the third floor in room 309. So if you want to talk about anything, any of the topics I'm talking about, just find me there and talk to me. I run my own company by now. I'm a IT consultant, mostly on cybersecurity topics, but also open source strategy, open source policy topics. So, I also know useful things. We can have a chat about that as well. I'm a consultant. I like to solve hard problems. I'm a game master, right? I love running tabletop role-playing games. I run mostly Dungeons and Dragons, but I've ran different kinds. I think it's the best hobby in the world. And there's so many cool things you can talk about with regards to tabletop role-playing games, right? There's dragons, there's magic, there's like a whole universe of things. I don't want to talk about any of that today, right? Because I'm not only a game master, which is one of the nerdiest things you can do, I also love licenses, right? And I thought one of the two is not nerdy enough, so why not give a talk about licenses in tabletop role-playing games? So here we are. As I said, I run my own company, so I can now say opinions are my own and those of my employer. That is really nice. I can say whatever the hell I want and not get fired. But standard disclaimer, neither of us is a lawyer, right? I'm just an interested layperson and interested in legal topics with a love of role-playing games, and here I am. So let's talk about legal stuff in tabletop role-playing games. Is anyone here who has never heard or doesn't know what Dungeons and Dragons is or what a role-playing game is? No. Okay, cool. So good starting point. So what is a TTRPG, a tabletop role-playing game, on if you look at it, right? And last year I talked about software licenses, and I started to talk about, okay, what is the source code? What is the binary form, right? When you talk about games, you see certain similarities. On the one side, you can say, well, a role-playing game is a set of rules and mechanics, right? So you have something like this. You have something like, to determine if an attack hits, you roll a die, you add a number, you compare some numbers, and in the end, you know whether the attack was successful or not. So that is on the one side, right? On the other hand, we have things that you would call the TTRPG product, right? Something like Dungeons and Dragons, which is made out of core rule books. It is made out of a fantasy setting. There's campaigns and adventure modules that are being built and sold that you need to run the games, right? And there's the whole texts and stories and characters that appear in those publications, right? So all the sum of these things make up what we could call, or what I will refer to in this talk as, the TTRPG product. And the gaming community is a fairly creative bunch, at least a few of them, right? So you want to be a content creator. Let's assume you want to create for an established brand, something like a custom monster or adventure modules, or you invented your own rules at the table, your rule hacks, and you want to publish them, or you just want to create a blog where you talk about your game that you run every week for your friends and that you really love, right? The very first legal thing, and I went a bit back and forth about the structure, right? But I'm starting with this one first because I want to spend most of my talk talking about the other thing. But the first thing that when you talk about an established brand that you will have to deal with is the topic of trademarks, right? So something like Dungeons and Dragons is a registered trademark by a corporation. You can't just go ahead and use Dungeons and Dragons material without asking their publisher, Wizards of the Coast, what you are allowed to do and not to do. And luckily, a lot of companies, as it is a very creative and creator-focused community, publish a lot of material if you want to create for an established product, right? There is on their now primary digital resource, D&D Beyond, they have the creator FAQ. Wizards has a fan content policy, which covers a lot of different things if you want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons or create things for Dungeons and Dragons in different settings. I also don't really want to get into that, right? I'm not, I want to go down to the nitty-gritty. I don't want to look at, there's an established product and we're creating for this product, right? I want to take a look at the rules and mechanics of the tabletop role-playing games. The thing that I want to refer to as the game engine. So everything that tells you what systems, what mechanics, and what procedures you need to use to be able to play this game. And at that point, that is where you need to start to talk about copyright with regards to games in general. And why is that? If you start to read up on the topics of copyright and copyright law, you see, you come across things like this. Right? Ideas, procedures, system, methods of operation, concept, principle, and discoveries are exempt from copyright, even if included or embodied in an otherwise copyrightable work. And you even see things like this. Game mechanics and rules are not entitled to copyright protection. Practically speaking, what does this mean? Right? Copyright does cover creative creations and things that are fixed in a tangible medium. So if we talk about something like Dungeons and Dragons, the original statement that we looked on, like the when does an attack hit, legally speaking is not covered by copyright. The player's handbook, however, is. Right? So this is a creative work, a book that is covered by copyright. What does that mean in technical terms, right? So let's say you want to create your own D&D clone. Can you do that? Well, the rules and mechanics are not covered by copyright, right? So yes, you can. And this is something where, again, we see actually a similarity between games and software, right? It is a largely held belief. It's been a while since I've been out of the game, but my understanding was algorithms are generally not copyrightable, right? The source code itself is. So in theory, even if you have worked on a piece of software before, a proprietary piece of software for a company, and you leave that company, you don't take any of their source code, you don't take any of their material, you just sit down and from your memory write a piece of code that does a very similar thing, you are not infringing on anybody's copyright. It's a very simplified view, but theoretically that is correct, right? So theoretically, you can sit down. You have played Dungeons and Dragons for years and years. You know the game in and out. If you put away all your rule books, everything, you just sit down, you create your own game, and it comes out to be almost identical to the rules and mechanics of Dungeons and Dragons. You're not infringing anyone's copyright as long as you're not like using names of characters that they also use and not using their artwork, stuff like that, right? If we only talk the rules and mechanics. So you can sit down and you can create your own role-playing game. Great, right? So now the question is, who needs licenses anyway, right? And the answer is very similar to why we love open source licenses, right? Yes, if I don't agree with the piece of software or the direction a certain piece of software is taking, I can instigate a Chinese wall, not look at any of their code, not look at any of their stuff, and just sit down and write my own thing. I mean, I can't, but generally people can, right? The same is true here. If you've played Dungeons & Dragons forever, and you want to create your own game, and you want to be really close to the original game, you can get rid of all of their stuff. Don't look at any of it, right? And sit down and write your own game. And you're fine. But the neat thing about open licenses is you don't have to, right? There is a legal framework that allows you to essentially fork the game of technically, and we'll get to that, something that also makes up Dungeons and Dragons. And this is what the open gaming movement is all about, right? So open gaming, and they even say it's a movement within the tabletop role-playing game industry with similarities, superficial similarities to the open source software movement. And the key aspect is that publishers publish their work under copyright licenses that allow others to make copies and create derivative works of the game. And it's very interesting, I think, to look at the one of the initial statements and interviews that was done by the vice president of Wizards of the Coast when Dungeons and Dragons was first put under a quote-unquote open license, because he does draw a lot of similarities. He does reference original essays by Richard Stallman. He talks about the cathedral and the bazaar, stuff like that. So it's very much inspired by the open source movement. One of the nice things when talking about licenses in open gaming is, in the end, there's really only 2 licenses that you need to know that are like a big deal. There is more, I will mention some, but there's 2 big ones that everybody's kind of talking about. And one of them you probably already know, which is the Creative Commons family of licenses, right? It's not really one license, but the Creative Commons family of license. And the other one is an interesting one. The other one is stewarded by Wizards of the Coast. It's called the Open Gaming License. And it has been deprecated, kinda. And why kinda? Because there's a lot of systems out there that are under the Open Gaming License, but the company that first published the OGL and is kind of the license steward, as we would say, no longer uses it for their own stuff. And if you are the kind of person that enjoys to read the open source license mailing lists in their free time, you might have a fun time looking up the OGL controversy of 2023. One of the reasons they are no longer using the license is because Wizards of the Coast tried to revoke the license in a way where everything that has been published in the past was supposed to no longer be covered under the license, which of course went down very well with the entire community. Like, people were super excited about that. And there was a lot of like back and forth, and then in the end, Wizards doubled down on their commitment to open gaming and moved away from the OGL as a confirmation for the community. Okay, we're using the Creative Commons license now. It's a license that this known entity is publishing. We're using it for our work, so you're all good. You're fine. Nothing's going to happen to your open source parts of D&D. So, and I want to look at some of the original material at this point, because as I've been talking about Dungeons and Dragons, because it's the big name, right? It's what everybody knows. Technically, and I will have that later, when drawing similarities to open source software, we would probably say Dungeons and Dragons is an open core game, right? Because what you will notice, if you look at, they call it the system reference document, with the newest version, the SRD 2.5.1 is the published document that contains the rules and mechanics that make up the latest versions of Dungeons and Dragons. And that is a very important distinction, because the system reference document is the only thing that is covered under Creative Commons, right? And they make it they take very good care to make sure Dungeons and Dragons and all the things that they have trademark rights on it, and that are very uniquely, like, they consider their own creative core creations, are not part of the system reference document, right? So what we actually have is, we have a set of rules and mechanics that is covered under the Creative Commons, that is not really Dungeons and Dragons, but that then is the same. Oh, you cannot see my browser. I'm sorry about that. Where's the? Geez. Okay. There we are. So I started from the same page that I screenshotted before, where you can find the different versions of the SRD. The latest one under the Creative Commons, and the system reference document. This is the only thing that is covered by the Creative Commons license, right? And they even go, like, make it a point to tell you that if you're creating your own fork of D&D, right, this is how you're supposed to attribute them. And none of this mentions Dungeons and Dragons, right? What they do tell, and there's a whole like ecosystem coming up with own kind of like logos where they say 5e compatible. So if you are creating based on the open source part of the SRD, that is what they want you to use, right? And 5e, 5th edition, is the latest edition of Dungeons and Dragons. Wizards of the Coast is about as smart in choosing versions as Microsoft is for Windows. So technically it's like the 2024 edition of the 5th edition of a game called Dungeons and Dragons. But yeah, they stick with the denominator of like 5th edition 5e compatible. And the old, which is also the 5th edition, but the 5th edition before the new 5th edition, which is covered in the system reference document 5.1. That one is now dual licensed under the Creative Commons license and the original Open Gaming license. And that one is interesting to look at, in my opinion, because you will see a surprising number of things that you might not realize are protected content and potentially even trademarks, right? So the Open Gaming license had this pointer, what they call the product identity, where they made it very clear everything that is product identity is not covered under the Open Gaming license. Only the rules and mechanics are, right? And then you notice, so you can talk about all of this as long as you don't talk about Dungeons and Dragons, D&D, Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master. Yes, Dungeon Master is a original creation of Wizards of the Coast. It might even be trademarked, I'm not sure. Right? And then stuff like the Forgotten Realms, Faerun, so things that are actual like creative worlds, creative organizations, creative creations where like, okay, that kind of makes sense. That is your whole, like the world that you've created, right? Things like Mind Flayer, Illithid, Beholder, right? So iconic monsters of Dungeons and Dragons that if you look at any version of the SRD, you will notice those specific monsters are not in any of the Creative Commons covered releases, right? What you will also notice, if you look at either of them, I'm just going to do a bit of a scrolling. There's no artwork, right? There's like rules in stat blocks and mechanics. There are no nice little stories about their worlds, so they are being, again, very careful to make sure, yes, the mechanical system that makes up D&D, as long as you only reference the system reference document, you are like using an open game, an open source game, and are okay to kind of like do your own thing. Yeah, that was, surprisingly, I had more than 0 minutes left to fill the excess time to talk about the Open Gaming license and the system reference document. And by wrapping up, I did talk about D&D a lot because it's the big brand name, but by no means was Wizards of the Coast the first one to publish an open source game, and they are also not the only one. So I do want to talk about various TTRPGs and comments about their licenses. As far as I can tell from when you research the topic, Dominion Rules is the one that credits itself as the first open source RPG. They do have their own, so that's why I said there are more different licenses. It's not only Creative Commons and the Open Gaming license. There are a few different ones, but most systems that are not either Creative Commons or Open Gaming license just have their own license that more or less says very similar things to what Creative Commons comes down to and what the OGL says, right? But you have Dominion Rules, which was kind of like the first one. You have Cairn, which is an old school revival game, so it's like harking back to what role-playing games were in the 80s. It's a very clearly, like a very purely, the whole thing that you find online is covered under the Creative Commons attribution share alike, right? So it's even a copyleft role-playing game. That is kind of cool. I did want to call out Gods and Monsters because they used a GNU free documentation license for their rules and mechanics. That's also kind of neat. And Open Legend, which is another role-playing game, which is also kind of neat because, and people can challenge me on that because I'm just a layman, but they have this clause, right? Any subsequent work derived or adapted from products under this license are equally subject to full terms and limitations contained therein. So they not only came up with their own open gaming license, they came up with their own copyleft open gaming license. So that is also kind of neat. But unfortunately, they use exploding dice, and exploding dice rule sets always go crazy and are kind of just suck. So too bad. But cool license. All right, and then finally, so these are like properly, everything that you can find that is published by them is under a free license. And then is what I would say is a group of open core systems, right? And this is the big movement that was kind of spun out of Dungeons and Dragons. The third edition of Dungeons and Dragons was the first one that was covered under the OGL. And then when they did 4th edition, a lot of people wanted to keep 3rd edition alive. And so things like Pathfinder came along, right? The 1st edition of Pathfinder was a fork of Dungeons and Dragons 3.5 under the terms of the open gaming license. And they were by far not the only one. Back then, Wizards of the Coast, what is called the SRD, they called the D20 system. So that was their name for like the game engine. And there is a whole bunch of D20 systems that still use this open gaming license and are like living, breathing projects using this document. Pathfinder, versioning in tabletop role-playing games is like, I don't know what they're doing, but okay. So because of the whole OGL thing, the company behind Pathfinder also had to do their own license thing. And they also had to do their own, this is the version, but it's not, it's the same version, but it's not the same version, right? So Pathfinder 2 2nd edition before remaster is covered under the open gaming license. But Pathfinder 2nd edition remastered is covered under the Open RPG Creative license, which is again a license that was created not only by the publishers behind Pathfinder, but a collective of, they call themselves like independent TTRPG publishers as a response to what happened with the Open Gaming License and Wizards of the Coast, right? So this is a thing to kind of keep an eye on. They're more or less interesting, but it's like the one big thing that kind of spun out of that for everything that didn't already use Creative Commons. And yes, nowadays Wizards of the Coast, the latest edition of D&D, uses a Creative Commons attribution license, and this is how they publish their stuff now. And that is everything I have to say on the topic of licenses in tabletop role-playing games. Thank you so much. Right, yes, I will leave my contact up for a minute, and you can find me on the 3rd floor at the Free Software Foundation Europe booth. Thank you.